Oh, hello everyone. I'm super excited to have you all here today. An amazing conversation we'll get to have. I'm your host Nirav Dave and warm welcome to Altrusia's global event on webinar on Business Fraud and Risk Management Summit. Today we have six amazing speakers who will be sharing their knowledge with us. And when I say amazing, these people really define what amazing is. I would also like to express my gratitude to our premium sponsor BioCatch and Cleafy and our gold partner True Native who made this event possible. And a special thanks to all our media partners. Just a little housekeeping. Before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat box on to your right. Our moderators will be watching them, and if necessary, they will bring them up during presentation or later after the session ends, we'll have a Q&A session. So our first presenter, I would like to welcome Mr. Mark Cheeseman. We are so glad you could be here today to share your insights on risk prevention and detection and managing fraud in global crisis, insights and lessons. Mark Cheeseman, OBE, is the Director, Government Counter Fraud Function and Chief Operating Officer for the Fraud, Error, Debt and Grants Directorate at the Cabinet Office. Mark leads and establishes the Center of Expertise for Counter Fraud at Cabinet Office, which leads cross-government efforts on improving government's ability to deal with fraud and economic crime against the public sector. He led the creation of the Government Counter Fraud Function and worked with other leaders across government. The Government Counter Fraud profession, a professional structure for those working in counter fraud across the UK public sector. He also he has also worked with Australian and New Zealand governments to help set up their own cross-government fraud prevention centers based on UK model. He acts as a special advisory to the Attorney General Department in Australia on continuing development of their Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre. Mark started his career as a filing clerk in legal aid agency LAA at Ministry of Justice. He later held various project management, operational and assurance management roles, including the role of head of counter and investigation which he held for a number of years prior to joining the Cabinet Office. In this role, he redeveloped the LAA's approach to countering fraud, leading to the first the first cross-agency prosecution with public bodies, a fundamental redesign of fraud risk management model, and securing a return on investment from counter-fraud function that exceeded its cost. Mark was a part of the team that successfully took the legal aid agency out of accounts qualification by National Audit Office. Now, without a further ado, we will turn the time over to Mr. Mark Chisman. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you ever so much for that introduction. That was very kind and means I don't have to do too much introducing myself, which is always good, although it is a little bit odd hearing someone talk about you in such terms, but very kind. Thank you. So look, I mean, I'm going to talk today about what we've learned in the UK public sector about managing fraud in a global crisis. And, you know, we are just coming out of, hopefully, in the COVID-19 pandemic, a very widespread global crisis that has impacted us all, both personally and in our work lives. And one of the most important things as people who work in the public sector or in any sector, in any way that makes our societies better and fairer and richer, is that we're continually learning, that we're challenging ourselves to understand the context in which we're operating, the difference we're trying to make in our sectors. So for me, that's the difference we're trying to make to the citizens and taxpayers of the United Kingdom, and continuing challenging ourselves to get better and to learn how to do that better. And I'm going to talk to you a bit today about our experience in managing fraud in that crisis in COVID-19 and what we learned from that and those key learnings. And I hope that's helpful. I do invite any questions. I hope I'm not breaking protocol here, but very, very pleased for any questions that do come. I'm happy to make it a kind of a discussion as much as me just giving pontificating on my experience. So just briefly, a couple of things of context to be helpful. I mean, they've been mentioned already, but I head up the Centre of Expertise in the Centre of Government, looking across fraud across government. In the individual departments in government and public bodies manage fraud risk themselves, have their own fraud teams that do that. We look at the cross-cutting picture and help out. And basically the way to think of it is, why would every organisation with the 240 odd public bodies in government learn by themselves how to deal with fraud? Why wouldn't you bring all that leading practice together and actively share it across the piece so people don't have to go looking? It's on their doorstep. That's what we do, as well as providing services, and that's why the profession exists and the function exists. I also set up the Australian Centre on a similar model and work with them. And if you haven't seen what the Commonwealth the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre, to give it its right name, and counterfraud.gov.au for any of you who are interested in websites. If you haven't seen the work they're doing, then that is excellent as well, and I highly recommend having a look at their website and their content. And as part of my experience in setting that up, I actually had my first, it wasn't a global crisis, it was a national crisis, but the first large-scale crisis where I was involved in trying to support in the management of fraud in that crisis. Because when I went over to Australia to help them set up their centre, the bushfire crisis happened of 2019. And as part of my work on that, I decided that one of the helpful things to do would be to co-author the International Public Sector Fraud Forum Guide to Fraud in Emergency Management. And again, it's on the internet, it's published. I highly recommend it as a read. I think I did the forward to it, as well as contributing to a lot of the content. But it is a guide to public bodies and organisations as well. I mean, we use public bodies because that's the sector in which I specialise. But a guide to how to deal with fraud in crisis management situations. So, what was COVID-19 for fraud? So the way I view it is, I view it as a compressor, something that compressed what we were doing before, the risks we were facing before, and made it more acute, more urgent. So we didn't actually see too many new types of risk, oddly. There are some exceptions to that. So if I look at the UK experience, the test and trace system, for instance, that gave a new type of fraud and how you're exploring that. The vaccine rollout, obviously, that gave some new piece to think about. But a lot of actually what we spent money on, the activity the public sector was doing, which was supporting communities, individuals, and businesses through the pandemic to help them manage through that crisis. We were seeing the same kind of risks in a different context that we'd seen before. Just more of them and compressed and at an accelerated rate. So I always find that helpful to think about as the context in which we stepped into and the experience of managing fraud. It wasn't a complete change, it was just more intense. So how do you manage fraud? Well, before I go on to what we learned from in that crisis, and therefore my guidance on how you manage fraud in a global crisis, I'm just going to step back to how you manage fraud full stop. Because as I said, it's a compressor. It wasn't new. It wasn't a change of everything. It wasn't a completely different world. It was just a compressor, a more urgent, more compressed way of dealing with it. So look, I'm a simple bunny, right? I can't take a lot of stuff. And I break how you deal with fraud down into two areas. The first is that you have to accept it. Now that sounds easy. Yeah, okay, we'll accept fraud. Let's move on to the next one. But actually, you need to spend time on that first one, because organisations don't naturally accept fraud, because fraud is seen as a failure. If you have a fraud against you as an organisation, if you lose a lot of money, if you are a finance director or accountable for spending with an organisation, you lose a lot of money. Or fraudsters take money from you. Let's not say lose a lot of money. Fraudsters take money from you. It's an aggressive act. It's not like you left it lying around. That is seen as a failure. So that can actually lead to organisations not feeling comfortable in accepting fraud and trying to argue it's not happening because that's success. And I'm not saying that's consciously. I think a lot of this is subconscious. But actually, you have to accept fraud. I've seen a lot of things in my time, not necessarily in the global crisis, but I'll give you a couple of examples of things I pick up on in the endless documents I read about fraud. They are organizations which say we have a risk of fraud. And I've read that several times. I've not read it once. That for me is an organization that is not accepting fraud. Because fraud isn't almost even a risk. It's a reality. You manage it as a risk, but the organizations, if you're spending hundreds of millions of billions of pounds, will have some level of fraud against them is a reality. But having to push to say a risk of fraud is telling you there's a cultural reluctance there. So to start with, those two things. Number one, you have to accept fraud and accept it. And in a crisis environment, that is accepting there will be more fraud. If we have to spend money more quickly, if we have to support people more urgently, that means we won't be able to do all the controls we would normally do. That means those who want to attack us will know that money is being spent more urgently and they have opportunity. That means fraud will go up. Accepting that, not trying to argue against it, is a really important first step, accepting your problem. Once you've accepted fraud, then, the second part is treating it as a business issue. Now that, if I just write this down on a piece of paper, accept fraud and treat it as a business issue, I'm not really helping anyone, because they're just statements, right? What do they mean? So what does the second one mean? Well, business issues are things that have measured inputs and measured outputs. You know how much you're investing, you know what you're getting for it. Too often in the past, fraud management has been treated as a value-based investment. And what I mean by value, I mean values like integrity, things like that, rather than cash. A value-based investment rather than a business-based investment. And because of that, you have investigation teams, and when do they finish their investigations, or things like that. It's we should do something, not we should have an investment with outcomes for our overall purpose and what we're trying to achieve as an organization. So I'm just giving you that context of how my simple way of viewing fraud management, that accepting it and dealing with a business issue with inputs and outcomes, how important that is to set the frame of what we learned in COVID-19. And I'll go back, because I'm about to move on to what we learned and my key learnings. I'll go back to, this was a compressor. We knew some of this stuff anyway. It just gave us more quicker experiences of really rooting these lessons in to us, and a commitment to do something to drive the agenda forward. So the first lesson I'm going to move to then, the first insight that I have for you on managing fraud in a global crisis, is the importance of expertise. The importance of expertise, and at the right point. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? So, what is a fraud expert, for a start? That is not a simple question. There's a lot of qualifications out there for fraud people. You've got ACFE, you have anti-money laundering, you have financial investigation qualifications, forensic accountancy qualifications. In the UK, we have something called ACFS. We have our own government counter-fraud profession, which sets standards, and was introduced for a very real reason. And the reason it was introduced is we have all these qualifications, but actually it's not like accountancy or being a lawyer. It's not as developed a profession. And often, I take my own example. I started my career in fraud and economic crime, counter-fraud, and economic crime, rather than fraud and economic crime, 15 years ago now. My introduction to fraud management was, Mark, please could you manage a team that no one wants to manage? It's the fraud team. I had no experience or background in it. Now I have 15 years worth of hard fought experience. But knowing who that expertise is so critical, and that's why we in the UK government invested in the counter-fraud profession. And it's a profession where you have to get qualifications to be in it. And then you have that kind of kite mark, that badge to say, this person's in the profession. They have a level of expertise and experience that you can call upon. And if our lesson of how you deal with fraud in a global crisis is the need to draw upon expertise at the right time, if you want to draw on expertise, you want a structure which tells you who has what expertise. And we must remember that fraud is not, there is no such thing as a fraud expert. That sounds weird. That's a great big statement, and perhaps one that I should qualify, because what I mean by that is okay, look, I'm a fraud expert, but I'm not an expert in everything to do with economic crime. Okay, I'm not an expert in investigation. I'm an expert in fraud and measurement. I'm an expert in risk management and assessment, how you do that. I have a good level of knowledge of data analytics and how you use those schemes. But actually, I have deep data analytical experts. I have deep investigation intelligence experts I draw upon, because I by myself cannot be a complete fraud expert. And actually, my challenge to anyone working on fraud is that no one can be a complete fraud expert by themselves. So how do we have a structure that shows what expertise different people have? The temptation is we need to do a fraud risk assessment. I'm going to come on to that. I'm giving you a hint of my second lesson learned. We need to do a fraud risk assessment. So let's just bring in someone to do it. Terry, sorry if anyone's called Terry. Terry, can you do this fraud risk assessment? That is not using expertise. I take back to my time when I was an IT project manager before I took on the fraud brief. And as an IT project manager, I knew that a generalist project manager working on an IT project would get, if they did a risk assessment on their IT project, would get about 50-60% of the risks through facilitating the amount of other people. A specialist IT project manager who had been there and done it and managed and delivered a lot of IT projects would get 80-90% of the risks by themselves, because they had that lived experience. And in working in managing fraud in a crisis environment, you want to call on that experience, because we're having to deliver services, take decisions, take policy decisions, make payments at a rapid pace. So we want our best experts to advise on what the risks are and the best way we can mitigate that risk. And we want them at the right point. So it's important we have confidence in our profession and that expertise. But also, the other insight I have is it's important we grow it. Because one of the challenges we had in the UK public sector is the profession was only 2 years old, and the counter fraud, so not investigation, intelligence, the other bits, the bits that I am more a specialist in, the structures for how you get qualified in that were still growing. It's important we grow the expertise with a changing, with what is a changing crime in fraud. So actually people can access that expertise. And we're not just, it's what we've got, it's how we're building in the future to have more expertise, more deep experts, more understanding. So then when the crisis points hit, which they will, there'll be more crises. I'd love to say this is it and there'll be no more crises, but we all know that's not true. So when those crises hit, you have that expertise, you have confidence in that can be drawn upon. So the importance of, when there isn't a crisis, growing your expertise in preparation for when the next one is. Okay, so that's area one for me, the importance of expertise. Area two is the important, I've highlighted this one, given a teaser to this one, is the importance of risk assessment. Now I'm a fraud risk assessment, that's I say fraud measurement, fraud risk management, fraud risk assessment is my real specialism. So I'm probably a bit of a broken record on this for anyone who's heard me speak before, but the importance of fraud risk assessment up front on any new scheme and doing as best as you can to understand the risks. And really importantly as well, one of the great things we have in the UK that I'm probably, one of the things I'm most proud of that we've achieved over the past 5 years is we are the first country to have a fraud risk assessment standard in the public sector, which says this is how fraud risk assessment should be done. This is what a good one is to meet the standard. And that in managing the pandemic was really, really helpful. Because I remember when we did new schemes and we did fraud risk assessments up front, everyone knew what a good fraud risk assessment looked like, all those fraud experts did. And we weren't working out as we go along. And then fraud risk assessment is traditionally an area where there's been no stuff. It's just been get an idea of fraud risk. But the important thing then, doing a fraud risk assessment up front, and this is the challenge in a crisis environment where you're working at such pace, getting into the detail. Temptation is to do a fraud risk assessment really high level, but you've actually got to get into the detail. And that may mean you might have to do some of it after you've part launched, whatever it is you're intervening is, and be agile to adapt your scheme. But getting into the detail is so important. And why? I've said detail like 4 times now. Why is it important? It's important because fraud is committed in the detail. So the way of stopping fraud is in the detail. If fraudsters commit fraud, they look at how they can get around what we've got. That is a detail environment they're working in. We will not be able to counter that effectively working up in a macro environment where we taking decisions just on division of responsibility or delegated limits or things like that. We've got to get our hands dirty in the detail. So there's upfront fraud risk assessments and getting in the detail. That's number two from my insights. Apologies, my computer beeping. It comes up when I've got things coming up. Well, a good timer reminder to me. The third thing then is the importance of post-event testing and looking for fraud and building that into your structures right up front. And this is in the International Public Sector Fraud Forum's guide. It's what we've done in the UK government. I could have done it better, I'm sure, and I hope we are going to learn about it. I'm sure we will, because we are a learning organisation. We take that very seriously. But we have to accept in a crisis environment, you're not going to be able to put in all the upfront controls you want, because we need to spend money quickly. We need to take action quickly. That brings all the more needs to put in the arrangements to be able to get money back where it goes wrong or where fraudsters take it, but also then to do good quality post-event activity to look for that fraud and have impact. Otherwise, and have an impact in reducing it. Otherwise, you are kind of allowing that fraud to happen. And that sends the wrong tone for a lot of reasons that I won't go into now. So the importance of targeted post-event activity, that is the third. The fourth, and again, this is in the International Public Sector Fraud Forum guide, is being mindful of when the initial crisis is over. The temptation can be to build structures at pace, because you're in a crisis, whether it's a global crisis, a national crisis, a local crisis, local flooding, whatever it is, bushfire crisis, the global pandemic, whatever crisis we're in. But actually, there is a phase when the emergency things have to happen at pace. There's a phase when actually support is carrying on, but that initial urgent phase is over, and you should be revisiting. And the temptation is to think the crisis will be over soon, so let's stop. So let's let it carry on, because it won't be long. Getting to that point and really having a very live, active conversation in your business, in your public body, if you're a public body, in your local authority, for yourself, I think is really critical. Because crises are in their nature unpredictable, and in their nature, by reacting quicker, we're accepting a higher risk environment up front. The longer we allow that higher risk environment to go on, the more we will suffer from things like fraud, and the more retrospective work there will be to do. So being mindful of when that urgent phase is over and being agile to redevelop processes and building in time to do that, not just moving on to the next thing. And my final, I'm giving you 5. So we started with the importance of expertise. I moved on to the importance of risk assessment up front and getting in the detail. Then targeted post-event activity to look for the fraud in the system and clawback mechanisms to end money back or take action sanctions on individuals who have misused the system because of that higher risk. And then being mindful of when we shift out of that first urgent phase, a difficult thing to measure, and it's often something you only see when you're past it that it happened. But the importance of that. Final reflection for me, certainly we had in the public sector, was the challenge for less mature organisations to react, and the importance of building structures, whether you're an individual business, whether you're a public sector, for them to be able to access capacity quickly. Again, that importance in building expertise, growing expertise out of crisis to be ready for when the crisis happens. Less mature organisations do struggle to adapt to a much higher risk environment, which is often out of their control. It's contingency planning. It's contingency planning, and in a structure like government, you have the opportunity to create hubs which they could draw upon. The pandemic was perhaps an extreme one in that it involved all parts of government to deal with it. Everyone working from home, all kinds of different things going on across government to support communities. Some crises are actually more localized within government structures or organizational structures. If you're looking outside the organization, and you can draw on surge capacity from outside. But the importance of that it is a challenge for less mature organizations that could lead to additional loss. So when considering that their risk profile has gone up, how you immediately look to surging that, go back to my first lesson learned, expertise, that confident expertise. So look, I hope that was helpful. Those are my 5 reflections. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm coming up to the end of my time. So I'm going to leave it at 5. My final thought for you in terms of what we're doing in the UK government. So the Chancellor announced in March that the UK government is going to launch a public sector fraud authority. And that public sector fraud authority is going to be increasing the support available to departments. I've just talked about how we support less mature departments. Increasing support made available to departments, reinforcing some of this upfront risk assessment with both capability and standards and so on, and scrutinising, I said about how you deal with fraud, accepting it, driving that acceptance, but also dealing with it as a business issue. So scrutinising how it is dealt with as a business issue and what outcomes they are. And the reason I mention that is because one of the most important things about managing fraud in a global crisis, one of my biggest insights, is the importance of learning. And that's where I started, the importance of learning. And one of the things I'm most proud of what we've done is that there are always challenges, but the Public Sector Fraud Authority is a signal of how the UK government is learning and is determined to act on the lessons it has learned over the past period. So I shall stop there, and thank you ever so much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to hand back to our compere.
Well, I see no other questions coming up, Mark. So we can end the session, and we are thankful for your such invaluable insights.
No, look, and oh, someone has a question.
There's one. Yeah, there is one question.
No, pleasure. I've got 3 more minutes, so happy to answer.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. In terms of fraud analytics, do you work on it in-house, or is it usually outsourced? One of the things about fraud, I think, is it's a great opportunity to collaborate across sectors, right? So it's a mix. We have an in-house analytics team with fraud experts, but we actually also outsource. We bring in external experts to help us in the tools and capabilities they have. One, though, opportune, it was the direction we were going. I talked about that surge capacity and the less mature organisations. One of the opportune places we found ourselves in through our work, but was that we had an in-house analytics capability ready to go that was then surged in to support some of the high-risk schemes. But that was balanced between an in-house, small expert team using external capability, openly procured public sector, to support it. So it's a mix, in answer to your question.
Okay. So there are no other questions. So
Brilliant.
Thank you again, and it was great having you. And I hope. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. We can go to the backstage and.
Perfect. Thank you so
out.
much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your session, and thank you for taking the time.